I've been part of this images of Sweden endeavor for quite a while. And I think one of the really great things about the fact that the project has been going on for quite a long time now is that you, especially for me as an historian, you start to kind of get this longer perspective on these changes. So my theme today is going to be about the identity crisis that I think perhaps is visible both within Sweden and in the eyes of foreign observers of Sweden. They are often quite confused about the state of Sweden today. And it's perhaps fitting that I'm sitting here talking to you from Austin, Texas, since during the pandemic, certainly Sweden was sometimes portrayed, as a kind of Scandinavian version of Texas in our more libertarian approach to dealing with the pandemic. Now, there is a kind of a overall, I think, tendency here that I will talk more specifically about, which we could, crude kind of term describe as a Swedish identity that has moved, from left to right in a sense. Starting like when I first came to the U.S. in 1970, it was all about socialism, social democracy, sort of a Sweden as a the right wing or left wing rather dreamland, and towards a situation today where gradually I think Sweden has been viewed more in a more complex way, experimenting with different types of liberal reforms. And then today, turning, in sort of context, both of the Ukraine war, but also the consequences of Swedish migration and integration policies, the whole situation with that, I think we're going to hear much more about it in subsequent speakers on this panel. The Sweden sort of becomes known as a home for violence, gang violence, crime, and so forth, murders, and etc. And so there's been a kind of a shift in perspectives to the left, to the right. So this early emphasis on Sweden as a good society in all regards, both at home and abroad, towards now being more focused on the realpolitik, getting tough with crime, joining NATO, and so forth. It sort of forms the kind of arch, of development. Now, if we look at specific aspects of this change, I've sort of alluded to them already a little bit, but let me just list four. I mean, they are perhaps not all of the ones that we want to talk about, but they are significant in all of these. One are the reforms, the neoliberal, we can call them, or liberal reforms of the entire welfare system that has, of course, been discussed before in the context that we're in right now, right? The liberalization of the introduction of school vouchers, introduction of free choice on various sectors of the welfare state represented a kind of radical break, from exclusive monopolies over welfare production. So that was already there, something that kind of started to shift, I think, the image of Sweden. And then more recently, we've had these two kind of major crises, really. One is one that relates to immigration, starting primarily or most dramatically perhaps in fall of 2015, where Sweden as a moral superpower kind of reached its sort of high point, right, in the standing out along perhaps with Germany as the country that received the largest numbers of migrants, and particularly refugee migrants. And that, of course, was consistent with this idea of Sweden as a moral superpower. And there's huge investments that has been made in that regard. At the same time, that produced unintended consequences, at least for many people. That is to say, the crisis that we're in now with respect not just simply to gang violence. I think that's important. Of course, murders are extremely visible and highly dramatic examples of a break with the social contract. But what we see, which I would say is more disturbing, really, is the tendency towards welfare crime and corruption and cheating that hits at the very heart of the social contract. That is to say, citizens that work, pay taxes, and receive their rights. And those types of crimes are sort of operating at the very heart of the social contract. And then finally, we have then the two events that I mentioned briefly. Also, the pandemic response that, again, seem to illustrate a shift in power relations between the state and the individual in Sweden in a very interesting way. Sweden stood out in that the idea here was that the state shouldn't just simply be trusted by its citizens, but the state should also be able to trust its citizens to take responsibility, make decisions about their health, be responsible, treat their citizens as adults, right, rather than children, which was kind of a new approach between the ratio between the state and the individual, as one might argue. So the pandemic response itself, right, then shook up the image of Sweden abroad. Some people, of course, wedded to a more paternalist tradition, hated it. Sweden was highly criticized for this, but on the right, not least in the US, but also around Europe, many people were applauding this more libertarian welfare state that unexpectedly exploded upon the international scene during this period. And that, of course, is even more relevant today when a lot of indications are that the Swedish response actually was perhaps not such a bad idea if we look just at outcomes. And I won't go into any details on that. Then the last thing, of course, is this application to membership in NATO, which in many ways is also a very dramatic break with the traditions that we've seen in Sweden. So then we may then ask a few questions about what is actually then sort of going on here in Sweden. I mean, as an historian, I'm not interested just in sort of the immediate contemporary expressions of a kind of identity crisis, but like, how are we to understand this? And I think that one I sort of briefly mentioned, and you can discuss that more, is the possibility that we've seen a sort of recalibration between the relation between the state and the individual. I mean, this is something I've written a lot about the idea of this alliance between state and individual in Sweden. There's a curious paradox of high trust society that maximizes individual freedom. But I think it's also true that there's been a recalibration of the power relationship. And the pandemic response, I think, is perhaps the most obvious example of that, but also the reforms in the welfare sector, right, that shifted some of the power away from the state towards the individual. So that has been one underlying secular trend during this period. And the other one has been this a tension between Sweden as a national welfare state on the one hand, and a moral superpower on a global scene on the other. Or put it differently, between nationalism and internationalism, between nationalism and globalism, to use some of these words that's been bandied about now for many, many years. And I'll say something a little bit more about that in my final comments. Then we also then see this, what I mentioned before, a turn towards more realpolitik, right? And here we see this in different areas. Now I just, point out to two, domestically, internationally, right? So that we're seeing a shift now quite suddenly, right, away from an idea of Sweden being neutral or unallied, which was a way, right, to retain, right, the purity, right, the moral purity of the Swedish position on the world scene, right. We were engaged in peace negotiations. We were not, devoted to preparing ourselves for war, right. But we've seen it now also in the domestic scene. This is a even much worse and much more tortured debate in Sweden. What to do, when citizens and residents commit crimes and kill each other. There are no self-evident answers. A lot of criminologists are up in arms about more harsh forms, right, of policies, because they are wedded, right, to the idea that many of these criminals are in fact victims of different sorts, right, for being at the disadvantaged part of society and so forth, maybe being discriminated against, being poorer, and so forth and so on. So to move towards a tougher regime, right, in the sort of spirit of realpolitik is not unproblematic, right? And it certainly also shakes up the international image of Sweden in this regard. Then, in order to try to sort of understand the kind of underlying tension here that we see that is still unresolved and in some sense still not, I think, thoroughly debated in Sweden, and certainly not understood very properly abroad, which is this tension or collision between two Swedish models, two images of Sweden, if you so will, right? The one which is the one that has defined life within Sweden itself, is the one that we used to call the people's home, right? That is to say, that's a social contract, very, very much, right? Centered on both the state and the nation, right? So the state, as our set of institutions that provide various types of civil and social rights. And on the other hand, nation, as some idea of community, right, where you actually feel that you have a common we. Right? Now, that was very central, right, to the way modern Sweden was built up. And underneath that was a very strong moral code, in fact. Sweden, we refer to the skötsamma arbetaren, the wholesome worker, someone who is an honest, hardworking person, prone to, being serious and not excessively involved with more kind of entertaining aspects of life, reliable in all ways. And this worker, right, was indeed working. In fact, work was both a right, but also a duty, right? And along with the duties came then paying taxes. And only after that, so to speak, did you then gain the right to claim all of the rights that we associate with welfare state. This is a very strong moral contract. And what I see in my own research, my own trust research, is that these values, right, that emphasize honesty, reliability, and so forth, skötsamhet in Swedish, are still embraced by the vast majority of Swedes. There is very, very, I would say, little, right, acceptance of cheating with respect to the welfare state. Now, the other Swedish model then was that of the moral superpower, which emerges in parallels to some extent, although it comes a little later, right, in the wake of the Second World War, Swedish sense of guilt and shame around its behavior during the Second World War. Starting then with Dag Hammarskjöld, who became sort of an icon, right, for promoting this new role for Sweden in the global scene. He himself, a Christian, a believer for whom, human rights was very much built on the notion of every human is equal in the eyes of God. So human rights really we should view as a kind of a secular version here, right, of a certain type of religious view of men in general, humans in general. Right? Now, this for a long time was not a big problem, I would say, in Sweden. We had this idea we do good things in Sweden, so we create a welfare state. We want to do good things on the global scene as well. So we become engaged in different types of policies related to human rights development, the 1% goal as far as contributing to the international development industry. Now, because this was occurring to different geographical spaces, nobody really noticed very well the fact that these were built on two different moral codes or logics. In the one case, that everybody contributes. The other one, though, was based on the notion of charity. And this all came to a head once the moral superpower, so to speak, enters into Swedish geographical space, where these two logics and sort of two systems, sort of bookkeeping, if you will, collide. And that is what we are experiencing today also as a great deal of political confusion about how to deal with, right, integration in Sweden, how to negotiate this tension between the moral superpower and the people's home. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Lars. Lars, has this changing image of Sweden from socialism to liberalism attracted more attention than usual?
Well, yeah, I mean, one might say it's a very confused situation, right? Because as I noted, right, it depends on what you're focusing on. I mean, during the pandemic, of course, right, that this kind of libertarian welfare state that became super interesting, of course, both to people who are critical and those who thought it was a good move. Today, though, is all complicated by the application to NATO and to the current sort of situation in Sweden with respect to gang violence and crime in general. So it's complicated. I think confusion is probably a better word to describe the way most foreign observers look at Sweden. Right? Of course, most people, as we talked about in the break here, don't know that much about Sweden to begin with. So it's not a very deep understanding at the popular level. But among experts, I think it's a very confusing time to try to say something coherent about the image of Sweden.
Do some politicians as well refer to Sweden?
Well, I mean, I would say that what we've seen now, I was just in Norway, right? I realized that maybe they don't qualify quite so exotically as foreigners, but it was very interesting there. I was there on discussion on trust and the pandemic. And certainly now they have a very different way of looking at what happened in Sweden during that phase than they did during the first wave, right? And I think, with respect, I think we're going to hear more from Nelson Fraser in a minute, right? Where, the vision, the idea of Sweden now as a haven for crime and murder obviously also alters things. So, you see politicians reacting to different parts, right, of developments in Sweden over these recent past.
Thank you, Lars.